In part 1, I went over the top 10 rules changes in D&D 3rd edition that revolutionized the game, and in this part, I break down what the new school of play is, talk about why it exists, and contrast it to the old school. Alright, so now finally, my final thoughts. How did these rules change the game of Dungeons & Dragons and how we play it? First is that these rules in 3rd edition fostered a higher power level of player characters. And I would say not everything here started with 3rd edition. It also reflected changes in gaming culture, I'll call it, at the time. As I pointed out, gaming had evolved. At the time, games were casual, short-form affairs where you died quickly. Video game technology advanced to provide longer-form entertainment, and people came to expect and demand it in their games. People's frames of reference of what fantasy was also had evolved. Before, in the earlier days of D&D, people thought of older fantasy and sword and sorcery fiction such as Conan and The Lord of the Rings. Worlds where magic was relatively rare, and there was kind of a medieval level of technology, I would say. There's a very famous article from Dragon magazine saying that Gandalf, if he had been a D&D player character, would have been a 5th level magic user. By 2000, people's frame of reference had changed. People had seen video games where people in these longer form stories got quite powerful and badass. We had the growing influence of anime in popular culture. And as technology advanced, we had the rise of the action RPG. That's a screenshot from Diablo. And games that just were more visceral and action-packed in general. We have gone far from the coin-op days where your typical game was about simply not dying. The goal of game designers was now to lavish players with content. 3rd edition also provided rules for having more permanent and customizable characters. The classic old school way of playing was to start with a dungeon delve, and every player didn't necessarily have only one character. You could have a stable of characters. Characters were temporary. One could die, but you have another one, or you can make a new one. A typical session might have people of drastically different character levels. Then once you got more powerful, you then explored the wilderness, cleared out an area, and the ultimate goal of the campaign, presumably, was to establish a stronghold. Now you are a person with political clout in the world, and the game now incorporates a kind of war game mode where you can declare war against your neighbors, etc. But in all of this, you can say that the main character was not any one character, but was the world. Now, of course, these are generalizations I'm making. I'm now going to talk about the new school way of playing. There are games that, of course, don't fall on one of these two extremes. Now what people are used to today is a consistent group of characters. You make your characters expecting, at least, that they are going to survive until the end. Character death is now much rarer, and the game master might have plans for how characters' personal backstories interweave with the adventures, and a broader plot. Now the main characters are, of course, the player characters. This is all supported by what 3rd edition ushered in, more survivable characters that also you spent more time making who were more customizable, where you wanted the game to not kill them off randomly. When the game was more lethal, it was typical to call a character something like Bob 2 or Bob 3 at low levels if they had a name at all. When people think of entering a fantasy campaign nowadays, people's frames of reference are often serialized stories with long-running story arcs, interesting characters who change over time, and the style of storytelling started emerging at the time 3rd edition came out in 2000. It's also common nowadays for players and GMs to play out and discover psychological character arcs in the style of many of these stories. This shift in style of play is also reflected in the style of adventures that were published then compared to now. The Keep on the Borderlands involves monsters in various lairs, and you explore a location. Today, we now expect most adventure modules published for D&D and Pathfinder to involve a escalating story culminating in a big bad, which, by the way, was a term coined by Buffy the Vampire Slayer that helped popularize this concept in the first place and came out at around the same time. Exemplifying this new style are the adventure paths that Paizo publishes for Pathfinder. They are called paths. There are planned story beats and plot developments. Of course, they're not entirely scripted. There's room for spontaneity in these and surprises, but this reflects a general change in what people expect from fantasy. And that is not compatible with older school rule sets where, let's say, Buffy the Vampire Slayer in episode 1 might get bitten by a snake and fail her saving throw. Another change in how the game is played is that we now have rules, not rulings. I am flipping the term around from the old school primer. Now that players have these very customizable characters, they now have big character sheets with many skills and other abilities. There's now a rules structure in place that says what you can do and what you cannot do, and rules for how to adjudicate what you do. In second edition, you could say, I want to take that sword out of that soldier's hand, and the GM would then make up a rule and ask you to roll a die. In third edition, you now have a defined ability called Disarm. You declare it, and immediately the enemy makes an attack of opportunity against you. Then you make opposed attack rolls. You get a bonus of +4 per difference in size category between your weapon and their weapon. The defender also gets a bonus of +4 if they're wielding their weapon in two hands. And if you fail, the enemy now gets to try to disarm you. Well, that sounds like a bad proposition. They get to make a free attack against you, but you can solve that by taking a feat called Improved Disarm. You, by the way, also need to have an intelligence of 13 or higher and have the expertise feat. Basically, you're bad at it unless you're good at it. This extends to outside of combat also. Explore a room for traps, make a search roll. Talk to a guard to convince them to let you through, make a persuasion roll. Also, if the rogue is much better at searching than you are, then maybe let them make the check. Also, the bard may be much better than you at persuasion or diplomacy, so maybe you want to hang back just this once. Some people may dislike what this does to the game. Having to take a feat to do something? First, I want to admit that Disarm is probably a poor example and undersells the style of play because it kind of comes off as a feat tax. Better to have a carrot than a stick when it comes to feats. But yeah, this does mean that it's you could call it a little less freedom, less free form. Having to look down to your character sheet before attempting something. Having rules to refer to, period, might take you out of the moment. But there are upsides to this approach as well. First of all, people like rolling dice. And people like rolling dice when their bonuses are big. And there's just some fun to randomness, period. Failing a bluff check, for example, can lead to a hilarious, memorable moment. Also, not everybody is good in real-life charisma, and they came to play a fantasy game where they're much better at it. Many people like having characters that are distinctive or are extraordinary at what they do. People want to have a character that can convince somebody to give their fortune. They're so good. People want to have the ability, like this Pathfinder 2e feat, to fall from an unlimited height and land on your feet. People want to have ways mechanically to show that, okay, since we're making a character that we are committing to for the long haul, we want them to get mechanically better over time. This is what a rules structure makes possible. And if we are simply falling back on common sense, if our frame of reference is what we in real life can do, then the extraordinary is less possible. We are moving from heroes to superheroes territory here, but some people want to be superheroes. This is one of those your mileage may vary moments. The same things that may feel empowering and liberating to one player may feel restrictive to the next. But at this time, I do want to give one rebuttal to the rulings not rules point made in the old school primer that I think a lot of old school players will agree with. A lot of people fell back onto rulings because the rules presented in AD&D, at least, were bad. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was advanced. It was not a rules-light system. It was a system that had many rules that people ignored for whatever reason. Either it was too much or it wasn't very helpful. And some rules were just plain not fun. I don't think people adhered strictly to rogues only having maybe a 10% chance to hide and a 10% chance to move silently toward a foe in order to backstab them. That went down to about almost a 1% chance. This is part of why I'm so curious about playing old school D&D one day, because I don't think people played by those rules. And I'm curious what they actually did. Another overall shift that 3rd edition ushered was moving from combat as war to combat as sport. Now, this is a term that I think originated with this post on EN World. Now, what is this? First, let me start from what most people are familiar with, which is combat as sport. There is the idea that when you encounter some monsters, then you are supposed to fight them. The GM would not have put this in front of us if it were too powerful. There's an unspoken expectation that the monsters will provide a fair challenge, one that the party can defeat. If you use the tools that the rules give you, such as those cool powers you have, and make sound tactical decisions within this rules framework, you will prevail. You're having a fair fight in the sense that your party and the monsters are having an open clash out in the open using your abilities. However, the expectation is that it's fair for the party, not the monsters. You think that the party will win. In contrast, combat as war entails danger, because even weak creatures can kill somebody in your party, if you're low level, with an errant die roll. Now the point is to not have a fair fight and avoid a fair fight as much as possible. If you're facing a well-guarded keep, better to find a way to destroy it or burn it down. If you're encountering two tribes in a dungeon who are hostile to each other, find a way to parlay with one side and foment a war. Old school D&D had rules for morale. GMs in newer editions always have the option to have the monsters decide not to fight and preserve their lives. But old school D&D empowered the players by having specific ways that they could cause them to surrender or run away. Something as simple as making a display of magic to kill one of them could make the entire other side give up. Also, setting up an ambush, surprising the enemy, or completely surrounding the foes. The author of the article used football as an analogy and said that someone who's playing in combat as sport will value the separate roles of the quarterback, linebacker, and wide receiver and what plays you can use to win a competitive game, while combat as war involves being too busy laying your end zone with caltrops, dousing the midfield with lamp oil, blackmailing the ref, spiking the other team's water, and bribing key members of the other team to throw the game to worry about all of those damn squiggles on the blackboard. Each of these two playstyles has its own strengths and has its own adherents. And sometimes I personally want to play one style and other times play the other. With combat as sport, many people don't want to be cautious. They want to kick ass and take names. They want action. They want to be the Doom guy. They want to use the abilities that they made their character with. That's what they find engaging. They want the feeling of overcoming their opponent with their power and their wits. Also, of course, this is more compatible with longer form play and having permanent characters. Combat as war, on the other hand, has its own appeal. People like the verisimilitude. People like the necessity of being clever and creative. People like having to think outside the rules, if you will. For them, that is the game. And 3rd edition told game masters, hey, here are the tools for you to create fair, balanced fights, the challenge rating system. And this reflected the trend already prevalent in the year 2000 of video games, which were many people's reference for fantasy RPGs, of scaling the challenge to your level. If they're not directly powering everything up when you level up, they are designing their adventures so that you're expected to have a certain power level when you enter a certain region. People want and expect those longer form experiences where your characters win. And in tabletop role-playing games, you don't have the safety cushion of being able to reload. 3rd edition's designers created the challenge rating system out of a feeling of necessity given people's changing expectations. Another change that 3rd edition helped usher was a shift from the GM being a referee to being an entertainer and a co-player. The word referee suggests someone who is neutral, even detached, someone who does not favor the player characters. The term dungeon master refers to a style of play where the DM literally designed the dungeon, which could kill the players and was designed to kill the players and defend its treasures against them. And once they've designed that dungeon, their job is just to run it as it is, to run a simulation. And if somebody dies, they die. If a certain fight goes south for the players, tough shit. They need to run away. As the old school primer says, forget balance. The new school of GMing involves not being neutral. They want the party to succeed and I'm sure vicariously feel their ups and downs. They're less concerned about running a simulation where villains fight to win and play combat as war themselves. Instead, they want to present a situation that offers the possibility of a thrilling story, one that is longer, where the PCs likely will survive. The GM, who's kind of a co-player who has this mindset, wants to create balanced challenges. And balanced means almost always that the monsters are weaker than the players. And if a certain fight goes south for them, it's not because the GM intended it, and the GM might adjust things behind the screen. Of course, I'm describing two extremes here. Some people may fall in the middle, and neither is inherently better than the other. You do want the GM and the players to want the same kind of game, however. So, some final thoughts. 3rd edition D&D ushered in the new school. 3rd edition was successful. Its innovations brought a new surge of interest and a rebirth of D&D. TSR, just several years before it, almost went bankrupt, and now D&D is today hugely successful. So apparently 3rd edition did some things right. A lot of the rules I've gone over in this video, it gave what many players wanted. And in fact, a comment I see said often from people at the time was that 3rd edition implemented house rules they already had at their own individual tables. They just now became core in D&D. Its success is also reflected by the fact that many of the changes that I went over in this video live on in present editions of Pathfinder and D&D. 5th edition walks back a bit on these changes, but is still firmly in the new school camp when compared to what existed before. And it looks like in recent years that the game continues to evolve along these same lines that I've gone over. Critical Role involves a very talented cast who get into character. There is a premium on story where both the meta plots and the personal character arcs are important. Death doesn't happen from some random die roll and you make a Bob 2. Death is now quite traumatic. And there's been a wave of people joining the hobby inspired by Critical Role and other streams who desire this style of play. And here we see a lot of the trends that I pointed out in this video magnified. It's now more common, I think, than before for players to come up with backstories, to work out arcs with their game master, and also to commission artwork or 3D printed minis for their characters. The culture of the game continues to evolve, and we can trace the big change in D&D's history, leading us here to 3rd edition. And stepping way back, it looks like we're seeing a continuation of the trend that started with war games where you controlled a unit of many soldiers, to Dungeons & Dragons, the first tabletop RPG where you control a single character. You're not a disposable character. That person is you, and you are a hero in a great story. So where we're going right now, well, maybe that's a video for another day. So that's it, I'm finally done. This video is a lot longer than I initially thought it would be. If there's anything I missed about what 3rd edition introduced, and anything you want to add to anything I say here, definitely share it in the comments. Also say, of course, what you prefer between the old school and the new. If you enjoyed this video, first like and subscribe, but also I have a playlist that you might enjoy that I'm starting to grow on my channel on the history of Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder RPG. You may also be interested in what I cover in a later chapter in the history of these games, where I talk about how Pathfinder 2e, I think, fixes problems that existed in 3rd edition D&D that were continued in Pathfinder 1e that was based on it. Support my Patreon, it allows me to continue making videos. You get early access to many videos and exclusive content, and join my Discord where we talk mainly about Pathfinder 2e, that has been the main focus of my channel, but also places to talk about other editions of the game, and also people can play Pathfinder 2e in our drop-in organized play system. So that's it. I have been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.